Sometimes I feel like I'm just existing. I'm not really living. I'm only watching the time slip away. I've forgotten who I am in you. I'm not who I'm meant to be. No, no. I'm drifting farther away from my destiny.
Welcome to Hearts of Purpose. I'm Gail Nordskog, your host, and today I'm going to be sharing some adoption stories of my own, some situations that are going on in China, and possibly touching on foster care and how maybe you can get involved in the foster care system and bringing a child into your own home. I want to start with China. China has a one-child policy, and as many of you know, that has been going on since at least 1990. It's been enforced. And there are two different ways. You might not have ever thought about, well, how do they go about enforcing this policy? There are two ways that they do this. One is through adopting. They allow their children to be adopted out, and America has been fabulous in bringing these children into their homes. My husband and I have had the fortune of being able to do that as well. We have 3 children that we've adopted from China, and I'm going to share those stories with you. And we are in the process of adopting another little girl who was originally born in China and now is living here in the United States. So these are very interesting stories, kind of touching how God really inspired my husband and I to bring these children into our home. The other policy that China uses is forced abortion. And I know that we all love our rights here to be able to choose, but these women in China cannot choose. We're going to be talking about that. I've got a fabulous film clip I want you to see done by Reggie Littlejohn, who is actually going around the world talking about the atrocities that are going on in China just today. And you'll be amazed at what's going on there. We think of China, we know it's a big superpower now, we know that it owns a lot of our debt, but what is it doing to its own people? What are their human rights issues? And it's something that we as a nation need to take a good, serious look at. Well, first of all, my story starts about 20 years ago when my husband and I got married. I was not able to have any more children. I fortunately have a grown daughter from a previous marriage, but I could never conceive again. And I really, really wanted a child with my husband. That didn't happen. We prayed about it, and it just didn't happen. 4 or 5 years went by, and we finally decided that maybe God closed my womb for a reason, because I personally would never have thought about adopting. So I said, well, I think I need to pray about this really seriously, if this is really something that God wants to do. And I set myself aside for 3 days. I prayed and I fasted for 3 days. On the second day of this fast, I felt God was telling me, yes, I do want you to adopt. Now, when I say God telling me, I'm not talking about a big audible voice, just something within me said, yes, I do want you to adopt. And at that time, I had friends that had adopted from Russia. So my leaning was to go to Russia. And also in that day, I felt God saying to me, I don't want you to go to Russia. I want you to go to China. Now, China is very interesting because it had to have been God, because I never would have thought of China. I had no friends from China. I hated the government. I knew it was a very cruel communist regime, and I just never had any interest in China. So by the end of that day, I went to my husband. I said, well, I do think maybe we should adopt, but what would you think of China instead of Russia? And my husband, he's amazing. He said, well, that would be great if that's what you want to do. So the next day was the 3rd day of the fast. I finished the fast, and by the 4th day, I said, that was crazy. That couldn't have been God. I'm not going to do this. This is crazy. So another day went by, and I started feeling really guilty. And I said, okay, God, if that was really you, I need to know for sure. I don't even know where to start. What do I do? Well, this is so true. The very next day in the Star, our local newspaper, there was a headline that said, 100 Ventura County families wanted to adopt 100 children from China. So I knew right then and there, okay, God, I'm going to do this. So I went to the adoption agency. I think it was called Adoption Services International. It's no longer here in our community, but it was called Adoption Services International. I went in to the agency and started the paperwork, and 2 years later, I brought home my first daughter. In that 2-year period, I had so many interesting things happen. First of all, 2 years seems like an eternity when you're a mother and you want to be a mother. You've made up your mind to go ahead and adopt, and it is taking forever. Paperwork seems just outlandish. There is so much you have to do for an international adoption. But we started, it's kind of like eating an elephant, take one bite at a time. So we just started chipping away at our adoption process. During that time, I also felt that God was telling us that we were to adopt 2 children, 2 girls. And I heard about a missionary who had seen triplets in the Kunming province area, but I didn't know that at the time. But it came out, a friend of ours told us about these triplets. And I thought, oh, that would just be so exciting. Just go one trip to China and bring home these 3 babies. That would really be exciting. So, and actually, my husband probably didn't find it as exciting as me, but I thought it was really exciting. So again, we started to find out where these babies are. Where are these babies? Can we get these babies? And it took me several months, but I was able to find the missionary who originally sent out this email. And he knew another person who knew about the triplets. He did not know about these babies himself. And he had told me that if I were to call him on a certain day, he would find out in that time where these babies were and how I could start the process to get these specific babies. Well, the week went by. I called him up. I think I called him a little too early. Sorry. He was sleeping. I woke him up, and he had forgotten to do this. He had forgotten to find out where these babies were. And he said, if you call me back in 1 hour, I will, call my friend back in 1 hour. He will be able to tell you where the babies are. Now, this is me calling Beijing. We had a really bad connection, and the name of his friend sounded somewhat familiar to me, but I thought, I wasn't hearing it quite right. I got off the phone and, I talked to my husband. He told me to call a friend of his in an hour, and I don't remember the gentleman's name right now, but it started to ring a bell of somebody that I had met in the past. When I called this man, sure enough, out of all the people in China, it was someone that I had already met and known in Los Angeles. He had become a missionary in China as well, and he actually knew the whereabouts of these little girls, and he told me they were in Kunming. What happened, that one of the babies had died, and now there were only 2 of them. So I was set. I found out the babies, I found out their names, I found out what orphanage they were in, and now I was on my way to Beijing, to the Chinese adoption agency. I was able to find their number and call them and start asking them, I was going to say harassing, but I really wasn't harassing, asking them if we would be able to adopt these particular little girls. China, the people in China don't have that much power, so if you do have power, you're going to use it. It makes you feel good. The woman that was helping out at the agency, who was in charge of placing children, she did not like the idea that we had found little children on our own. That was a no-no. China, their policy is, you want a child, tell us what you want, we'll give you whatever we want, whatever child we want to give you, but we'll pretend we're meeting your needs. she wanted to be in control. So she kept telling me, no, you cannot have these babies. Well, I found out that I could go to Beijing and talk to them directly by going to a boat show in Shanghai. My husband at the time had a boating magazine, and we could go there as business people and get into Beijing that way. So that was what we did on our first trip. We actually went into Beijing, met the people there in China, and talked to them about the possibility of adopting these little girls. And they told me no, couldn't do it. We were already there in China. They said, if you want a child, you can have this child. And they showed me a picture of a little girl. And I knew that I had to make up my mind quickly, even though my heart and soul and everything was set on adopting these little girls. I knew that I had to make a decision. So we said, okay, we'll take this child. About a week later, while we were still in China, we were given our little girl. They came into our hotel room carrying this pitiful looking little girl she was dirty and hot, and she was nothing like I had imagined she would be. And they handed us this little girl, and the only thing they said to me and my husband was, she's very strong-willed. And they walked out of the room with this sleeping child, and we were sitting there with this little girl for about an hour before she woke up. And when she woke up, she was screaming and screaming, scared to death. We couldn't communicate with her. She could only scream and cry out of fear. It was a pretty intense couple of days before we were able to calm her down and get her to trust us. That little girl has turned out to be the most precious person and such a joy in our lives. Her name is Christiana. She is now 15 years old. At the time, she was 22 months old. And that's my first story with adoption. There's so much more with her story that was going on in China and some of the ways God was working in our hearts. One thing I do know, why we went to Beijing at that time, I really believe because I had the opportunity to talk to the head of the adoption agency there in Guangzhou. And I told him that American people wanted to adopt two babies, at least two babies. And at the time, China would only let Americans adopt one. They were holding us to the one-child policy. Within a few weeks after we talked with him, they were allowing Americans to come back and adopt at least one more baby. Now you can go to China and adopt, I think, up to 5 separate adoptions. But there is a catch. It is now 6 years. What I thought was long before, it is now 6 years before you can actually bring a baby home. So let me stop here with this story, and I'll come back and tell you what happened with my second adoption. My second adoption story. Hannah, my daughter who is now 16. After we brought Christy home, and also knowing that there was a second daughter that we needed to go back for, we decided to contact an evangelist named Luis Palau. He happened to be in the area, and we knew that he would do some crusades in China, actually in Beijing. So we got together with him briefly and spoke to him and asked him if he would just be praying for us about this second child. So my daughter's actually named after Luis Palau. Her name's Hannah Louise. He did pray for her. Just a few months after talking with him, I got an email from the agency in China, and they had a little girl who was 4.5. Well, she was not quite, she was about 4 at the time. And they sent me a picture of her. She was the most pitiful looking little thing in this picture. She looked like she had been crying and her hair was sticking out all over, and she was just a sad looking little case, like she had been crying. And you know, I said, this is our little girl. We're going to go for her. We went back to China that summer, the following summer, and we met our daughter, Hannah.